Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of How Stories Work. Today, I want to go over the brand new feature in Subtext, which are scenes. If you're familiar with the dramatic theory of story and how it works in Subtext, you know that there is the story form. And the story form here gives you all the different story points that appear in a complete story, organized by through lines. These are the four major through lines. And you can see for each through line, there are a set of four transits that relate to the acts in a complete story. For instance, this is the same exact story form as the original Star Wars. We have Luke here as the main character. We have Ben as the influence character, their relationship, the mentorship, and the relationship story through line. And here we have the rebels versus the Empire in the objective story. And you'll see here these four transits: doing, learning, obtaining, and understanding. Those are the various thematic cycles that the narrative has to go through in order to tell this story of a triumph, a story where if you abandon testing yourself all the time, then you can actually stand up and fight against an empire. When you go to actually write your story, what you first want to do when working with subtext is to work through the through lines here. This is that same objective story through line. You'll see it's organized by those very same four transits: doing, learning, obtaining, and understanding. And in between each of them is a story driver. And the story driver is what most people would understand as a plot point. It is a specific relationship between this transit that moves it out of doing and into learning. So essentially, how does the story move out of doing into the thematic exploration of learning? And then how does it move into obtaining? In Star Wars, the first transit of doing is the bad guys chasing down the good guys. They're trying to get the plans. And then in the first plot point, the Empire decides to take things a little farther and ends up barbecuing Luke's aunt and uncle. And that moves it out of just simply chasing them down to now letting everybody know, learning, essentially like teaching everybody how serious they're taking things. In the beginning, it was just, hey, we're just going to board this ship, even though we know it's peaceful because we think you guys have something. And then if you run away, we're going to chase you. Now we're serious. We're going to take this a little more violently. And then the end culmination of learning is when they finally let everybody know, teach everybody the full destructive power of their new machine by destroying that peaceful planet of Alderaan, which then moves into the transit of obtaining, where the good guys come in and escape with the princess and the plans. And then finally, the very last transit is the big battle where everybody comes to a better understanding and a better appreciation of what it takes to actually win the war. That's the entire story of Star Wars, seen just in the objective story plot. If you were to write a story like this, what you'd want to do is go through and you just write down the various transits here and you explore that and you get a basic general idea of what would happen in each end. You'll notice this is not necessarily scenes. So what happens within this doing? What happens within this learning? To do that, what you would do is you would come in here and you would break down this story beat into the progressions of this transit. If I break down the transit into its four progressions, now we can see it goes through fantasy, fact, security, and threat. And these are thematic cycles. They're not necessarily scenes. They might end up as a single scene, but for the most part, they're how the narrative is moving through its thematic exploration. What are the thematic topics that it's going through as it's exploring this learning aspect of the objective story? We'll start out with fantasy, then it will go into fact, and then there will be some evaluations of defenses, and then finally threat. Threat definitely works great because that's when Tarkin threatens Leia by saying, hey, if you don't do this, I'm going to blow up your peaceful planet. And then he does it. So that one works great here. Fantasy is, if you think of the moment right after Luke's aunt and uncle are done with, then the fantasy is that boardroom scene where they're sitting around and they're congratulating themselves on what a great job they've done. And then Vader says, hey, be careful, don't be so sure. And then there's an argument over believing in superstition. So that's this part here. The fact is Luke and Ben heading to Tatooine and finding out just how difficult things really are. The security is when they bust out, and then also finding out that Leia is really strong and not breaking down, which then gives him the idea of doing threat. This is a great way to create an outline that's meaningful. It's not completely random. It's not subjective in terms of what, most people would consider fun and games in this area, which is a little more wishy-washy. This is specific thematic issues that you're going to go through step by step in order to tell the story of someone who gets over a problem of test, always testing themselves, to finally trusting in something more. Once you break down those transits into the different progressions, you can actually even go further and break down a progression into the events that appear. So if you don't have any idea of what this progression is supposed to be about, and you want to know what's supposed to happen, all you do is break down the progression into events the same way that you broke down a transit into progressions. And now it will show you, look, proven, result, process, and presumption. So those are the 4 events that make up this progression of fantasy that makes up the first step of the transit of learning. You can see it's events within progressions within transits tell the entire narrative. And it just so happens in this case, this actually tells a complete scene. Prior to installing the scenes feature into Subtxt, this was all something theoretical and something I had to explain to everyone. Now I no longer need to do that. Once you work through the various through lines, here's the main character, here's the influence character, then what you do is you step into the different acts and you can start to create scenes that will hold or be tagged with these various temporal progressions. If I just added a scene here into the second act and perhaps maybe another one, you'll see now we have 2 scenes here that are untitled. And maybe I will call this one the boardroom scene, which is where Vader and his little buddy have their back and forth and he chokes him out. In order to do that progression, which I know is this 5th one here, I can jump back to the objective story progression and see that this is the fantasy one. And I'm going to summarize this and say fighting over who is responsible for success. All right, so that's the idea of this progression. When I come back to that act and I see fighting over who is responsible for success, I can either drag and drop this right into this scene, or I can simply go here and click on the scene that I want it to be put into. And now this scene here has fighting over who is responsible for success. You can do that for all these different scenes. So maybe the next scene is going to be a strict main character scene. So I will go ahead and put that there. The scenes are now holding the progressions, and you start to get an idea of how you move away from structure into the actual storytelling when you go through and start moving away from this structural approach to the meaning of the story. And the scenes are where you start to conceptualize how everything is put together. Then when you finally get into the treatment, this is going to be your familiar Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 that have the various scenes that you are then going to download into whatever app that you're actually writing in and not think about structure at all. The whole point of Subtxt is not to keep you in this destructive artistic loop of continually thinking about structure and continually overthinking everything, but really to give you a jumping off point where you take the meaning of the story, which is abandon putting yourself to the test and you can do something risky, which this was random, but this actually works great for Star Wars. How you can take that, get the 4 major threads of that complete story, and then in the scenes section, begin to start weaving them into the story that is going to end up being the final result. Here I have the actual Star Wars story form and what that would look like when you start to build it up. For instance, right after his aunt and uncle, he finds them dead, he realizes there's nothing left for him on Tatooine. So that's a main character transit in the second act, which has to do with the past. So he's realizing all this stuff I'm done with. I can move on. There's nothing left for me here. And that takes on that main character transit, and that part of the story's over. And then you can now move into the objective story. Here you can see that entire boardroom scene with the progression, the overall idea of what goes on in that scene, and then the specific 4 events that happen, which if I were to come back into the objective story and see here, the Force is an ancient religion, you'd see the illustrations of the other star systems will fall in line and it's all because of us. And then Vader shows that guy the effect of not believing in the Force by choking him out. That's a synopsis of it. This particular events are proven, result, process, and presumption. This progression starts out with everyone in a place where they've proven that they're the best and they're a great situation. And then Vader's like, yo, don't get excited about it. It's nothing like what I can do. And then that guy comes back and says, your sorcerer's ways have not conjured up any stolen plans or anything like that. Then they have an argument back and forth over the process of things. And the way that you're going about doing things is really sloppy and not really the reason why they got there. And then he starts to choke them out. And then at the end of that scene, it ends up in a place where there's some doubt. When they entered the progression feeling, hey, we've proven how great we are, by the end, there is some doubt as to whether or not they're the greatest thing in the world or if this force thing is actually something. Not that they would necessarily be thinking about it, but that the author is exploring the meaning of what that scene is actually about. So it's moving from this place of where things have been proven to then getting to a place where you can't really presume that you've got everything. There might be something more, which creates potential for the next progression. This is the actual storytelling that would end up in your final treatment. Coming back into Act 2, you can see this here. We have those 4 events here and the progression. So these 4 events and the progression are there. And you don't necessarily need to have this overall summary here. It can be nice when you get into the treatment. And I see this boardroom scene. This is that big overarching progression here, that summary of it. And then you can see those 4 events just listed in order. He walks in, says everything is great. Don't get excited about what you've done here. Your sorcerer's ways have not conjured up stolen plans. Then they argue over each other's process. And at the end, there is some doubt that the empire is all that it can be. At the end of the scene, some doubt that they're actually masters of the universe. You can see here, there's no structure, which is exactly where you should be going to. You have the meaning of it here in the objective story. And then as you work through and add and weave in the different story beats, you're setting it up so that when you get to the treatment, you don't even have to think about story structure at all. You just go ahead and do that for all the different story beats. You don't necessarily need them all. If you don't want this summary up here, you could drop this down into the basement. All the story beats that you have yet to add to a scene are kept down here in the basement, and you can either bring them up or you can leave them down here, whatever it is that you want. And then when you go back into the treatment, you'll see that synopsis is left because you really have taken care of it with these 4 events. This particular scene has an entire progression in it. Like it works through these 4 events. But there are some other scenes that are just a transit. You don't necessarily need to break it down and get into more detail. And there are other places where the events in a progression will be split across 2 different scenes. For instance, the one here, Tarkin's bargain for Leia, which is that one where he threatens to blow up the peaceful planet of Alderaan if she doesn't give up the information. There are some specific events here that happen. The one that really stands out is this ending. So the Empire terminates the entire population of Alderaan. That's pretty specific, right? And this was completely predicted by the narrative model inside of Subtxt. This is not something that I added. The narrative model says if you're going to tell this story about somebody who's going to abandon testing something to get to a place of trust, then somewhere near the end of Act 2, there's going to be this threatening part that is going to bring an ending to what is going on. And then that is going to lead to a hunch. This is that moment at the end where Ben has that heartburn where he leans back and has a hunch that a million voices have called out in fear. That's the culmination of that threat. These are split out across 2 separate scenes. If I come in here into Act 2, you'll see this is the scene with Tarkin and Leia, where he threatens her and he ends and terminates the entire population of Alderaan. Then the next scene is when Ben gets that heartburn feeling and then teaches Luke the lightsaber thing. Right afterwards, he does the thing with the helmet and all that stuff. That would put this event here right before it. You can move these all around and you can see here, while this progression consists of this objective story event 30 and this objective story event 32, they're actually spread across 2 different scenes. Knowing that, now you start to get an idea of the conceptual model of how subtext helps you tell a story. You first get the narrative down, you get the meaning of the story. Then you work your way and you build up the 4 threads that tell that particular problem from 4 different points of view, 4 different perspectives. Then you begin to create scenes and you weave those threads in and out. You can see here main character, then objective story, a little more objective story here, and then the lightsaber practice is actually an influence character transit. And then that ends when he's able to help Luke see that there's a different way he actually influences him to get to a place where he can trust something outside of himself. And then at the very end, I would just come in here into the treatment, and this is all pure storytelling. The Empire threatens to blow up the peaceful planet. She doesn't give up the information, and the Empire terminates the entire population. Then the next scene, he has heartburn because he has a hunch that a million voices have called out in fear. That ends that idea of the objective story transit there. And then we can move effortlessly into the influence character transit, which is challenging him to see things differently by putting on that blast shield and having him move from a place where he's working solely on instinct to then conditioning himself to trust in something outside of himself. So that's the new scene feature in Subtxt, and hopefully a good idea of the mental model behind it. If you have any questions, please let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, I will see you next time for another episode of How Stories Work.